Okay. Okay, so I would just say I am presenting from University of Australian National University here in Canberra. So just before I continue, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this country, and I also pay my respect to the elders of the past, present, and emerging. And I also like to acknowledge everyone who is here this morning for the presentation. I will be talking about what is on the screen, as you can see, a vernacular grammar of a spoken language. And so let me give you a simple outline of what I'm going to talk about this morning. This is what I'm going to talk about. First, I'm going to briefly introduce to you what I consider to be the linguistic scholarship approach that we know of, basically how linguists do their research and then write up findings of their research on a spoken language. And then I'm going to talk to you about what we do at Kulu Language Institute, and I call that the Kulu Vernacular approach. And then before I go on to talk about how we have come up with meta-languages or terminologies to describe the language, I need to talk about something of the written and the spoken languages. This is important because it's going to have an implication on how meta-languages are produced or created or invented, which will then lead me to talk about and introduce to you the actual meta-language principles that I think I have discovered so far in my research. And then I will go ahead and introduce to you the Kulu meta-language terms, and then a conclusion. So let me go on now. Let me start by saying that this is the way linguistic scholarship approach has been done. So usually a linguist would go out and study an object language or a spoken language, and then he or she would write up the findings in a scholarly language. I highlighted scholarly language, and also using a meta-language. I'm going to say a little more about meta-language, but basically what this means is that a scholar writes up a research or a grammar or something about the spoken language in a language that's usually just difficult. The meta-languages are very specific terms that are used to describe the language, but not so easy for any everyday person who is out there. And then usually what the linguist does is he or she would share what he or she finds about the spoken language and shares it with other linguists who engage in conversation with the linguist. Now, let me start by defining what a meta-language is. This is a simple definition of what a meta-language is. Basically, it's a language that is used to describe or analyze another language. We need to say a little more about this, but a language doesn't have to be in a different language from what we call another language. So a language like English, for example, can be studied using certain terminologies. It's those terminologies specifically created to describe a language. That's what we call a meta-language. Another language may actually be a different language, so maybe another spoken language. So a study could be done in English, but actually doing it on another language. So when we talk about meta-languages, for linguists or in linguistics, these are some examples of what we call meta-language. These words that I have on the screen are words that any linguist knows what they mean, and they use it every time they speak about a language or study another language. And these are things, there's just, I will say, any linguist knows this. But it's not the case that others out there know the meanings of these words. So this is really another language, that only linguists know, but they use this to describe another language. Now, this is basically the way I would say the linguistic scholarship approach is. So a linguist or linguists go out and study a spoken language, and then writes up the findings in a scholarly language using metalanguages. And then that research or grammar or whatever it is sent out to a community of linguists. And so there is a conversation between the linguist and other linguists who are interested in the findings about that spoken language. What you will see on the screen is that the community of speakers are really left out of this approach. The community of speakers, they are usually engaged, but it's not necessarily all of them. Maybe one or two or three from that community of speakers would give data to the linguist, who then studies the language and then writes up the findings of that language. On the whole, the community of speakers are really left out of this approach. So the question that I have been asking the last more than 20 years now is this: can the speakers of a spoken language be given a meaningful meta-language in their own language? Basically, the question is this: can the speakers of a spoken language study their own language in their own language? That's basically it. And what that means, of course, is that if they are to study their own language in their language, then a set of meta-language needs to be created or invented. And that meta-language is something that they need to understand themselves, so that when they use it to study their own language, they know what it is. So that is the basic question. That is the basic question that I have asked. And I think I have also answered it. And that's the we have formed Kulu Language Institute to do that. So for this presentation, I call it the Kulu Vernacular approach. Kulu really stands for the two languages that are represented. It's the Kubokota and Luqa. And this is the approach we have used. So a linguist goes in, studies the spoken language, and then writes up the grammar or the study of that language in a meta-language, but it's a meta-language that the community of speakers know. And so because they know it, they can use that to study that spoken language, and that spoken language is their own language. So there is now the conversation between the linguist and the community of speakers. And what you will note on the diagram is that the community of linguists are really left out of it. This is it's really a shift in the focus in the way that language is studied. So the grammar or the grammar is written in the meta language that the community speakers know, and they are involved and engaged in studying their own language. So this is the approach I'm talking to you about. Now. So basically, I'll say that I have written a vernacular grammar for Lunga language. Lunga is my own language, and I'm a native speaker of Lunga. And that meta language is used to describe the Lunga language, and it has been used to teach speakers of the language by the Kulu Language Institute. And this has been going on for more than 20 years now. So what I'm going to talk to you about now is what I have done in the last 20 years. I will say that I think it's not the usual way of doing it. Usually a linguist goes out, comes up with some kind of a good study on it, and then writes a grammar on it. I have studied, I have actually come up with a grammar, and now I'm studying, trying to find a linguistic basis for what I have done. So in some ways, I think I'm working backwards, but I find it interesting. The main question I'm asking now is really this. How have I, what have I done, or how have I done it to be able to come up with that? Are there any principles involved? I'm going to focus on that question a little more, but let me tell you where the Kulu Language Institute is. So Kulu Language Institute is in the Solomon Islands, and it's located on an island very close to Gizo. It's called Ranonga. And that's where the school is. That's where they use this grammar for more than 20 years now. And it's a very vibrant language community movement. People are studying, and people from other language groups are also coming to join to study in the institute. Now, before I continue to talk about what I call the meta-language principles, there is something I think I need to talk about, and I want to highlight certain things about that is true of written languages or any written language, and contrasting it with what I think is true of spoken languages. This is going to be important, especially when I start to talk about how the meta-languages are created or invented for written languages, and then going on to ask and answer the question as to what we expect when we try to invent or create meta-languages for spoken languages. So this is it, the written language. When you think about a written language, English or German or French or those major languages, there is usually a scholarship tradition. Things are written, so the ideas are written. There is a history, written history, tradition, and the language and all that. And so you can go there, go to the libraries, if you access libraries, get books and read about ideas that are written. I call that there is a scholarship tradition. I like to call it scholarship world because I anticipate another word that I'm going to use just in a moment, which is the natural world, which is what I'm getting into now. When you look at a spoken language, for example, for a spoken language, there is nothing written. So when they want to talk about ideas, they cannot go to books, but they have the natural world out there and the traditions that passed on, and they are passed on orally. So they pass on ideas, the history, tradition, and all that, and they have their own language that they use to talk about things like, but there is really nothing written. This is important when I try to talk about other things in just a minute. So when it comes to a written language creating or coming up with a meta language to describe the language, usually because there is already a scholarship tradition in that written language, the tendency, or what is normally the practice, is that you inherit terminologies from a prior history or tradition. So take English, for example. English has a lot of meta language when you look at linguistics. English inherits from Greek and Latin, words like morphology, phonology, phonetics, syllables, semantics. Those are all words that are derived or adapted from Greek. And then other words, English also draws heavily from Latin, words like consonant, vowel, prefix, suffix, and all those. You can trace those all back. That is possible because for a written language like English, there is already a tradition. There are books out there that you can go and read about those, and you can collect ideas from those books. So basically the idea is, when in a written language, you try to come up with a meta language, you basically inherit what is already there in the books or in the tradition. There is already a tradition, scholarship tradition that is available to anyone wanting to do it. What about the spoken language? Well, for a spoken language, there is really nothing written, but there is, so they cannot go to books and read about what has been written, but there is the natural world. There is the environment, the culture, the events and existence, and the human experience, and it's there. And so you can only invent, because really there is no book for you to go and collect ideas. So this, I think, is important. Comparing or contrasting what is the case for written languages, and also what is it like for the spoken languages. So basically what I'm saying, when I ask the question of wanting to come up with meta languages for spoken language like Lunga. For the written language, they inherit or adapt from what is already there. There is a tradition that is available, written one. For a spoken language, you could only invent. Now, the question is this: are there any principles that can be stated or identified in that the meta languages invented in written languages? Do they follow certain principles to come up with a meta language? The question is important because if we are able to answer that question and say there are principles that have been followed to come up with the meta languages in written languages, then those principles can then be used to come up with meta languages for a spoken language or any spoken language. So I have raised the question, but I think I have also answered it. And what I'm going to tell you now are findings that I have to this stage, to this point. So I have basically gone back and read what others have done in the history, going back as far as the Phoenicians, who came up with a Semitic alphabet that has become the first alphabet from which Greek and Latin, all that they adapt to now. We are using the Latin or the Roman alphabet. But also I'm also looking at what others have done in the past and also in the present. So this is my what I think have been used by linguists, scholars past and present, to come up with what we call the meta languages. So what I have there are 10 principles. And let me just talk a little bit about what I mean by the natural world and the lingual world, because to have a better understanding of that can explain a lot of what I'm trying to say. So when I speak of the natural world, I'm simply saying the world that we live in and anything that is out there, the objects, the events and happenings out there in the world, anything that is in the world, and the whole creation, that is the natural world, the nature. Lingual world, lingual has to do with language. So when you look at a stone, for example, that's an object in the natural world. When you write the name of the stone so that you have like S-T-O-N-E, then now you are raising that object into, putting it into a lingual world so that you can analyze a word. Now you have a word. So the object stone is a different thing that you can find in the natural world. But once you give it a name, such as a stone, then now you're putting it into a lingual world. So you can analyze the word, not an object itself. Okay, why is this important? There are 3 principles that I think they are directly, in some ways, related to the natural world. Those are the 3 at the bottom. And there are 7 principles that are really language related. And I think these are the principles that linguists, or I also think, although I'm only referring to linguistics, I think other people in other fields of study are using the similar kind of thing. So what I'm going to do now is to try to explain to you some of these and then give examples so that we understand what it means. Usually we start from the natural world, and then once we just start turning things into the words, then we are now in the lingual world. What I call the onomastic principle is really just a naming principle. When you name a stone, then you're applying what you call an onomastic is really just a Greek word for meaning name. The word that I have coined for this purpose is really, I am still learning to pronounce it. It's the Metonylingual principle. You will not find that in the dictionary. I just came up with that. The Acrophonic principle, both of those principles, they name an entity in the natural world, and then somehow using those 3 to come up with the meta language. I will explain a little bit more. But the three principles at the bottom are the very basic principles. Once you get up to the 7 principles, you're dealing with language. So you're referring to anything that is language related, words, phrases, and clauses and all that. Let me now explain, because this is a word that I have just coined for this presentation, for this research. So metonylingual is really a word, I've taken it from 2 words, from metonymy and lingual. And I think it's an important principle. The word metonymy it's really when a word for one thing is used to refer to something related to that thing. I will give you an example. Lingual simply means relating to language. So let me now talk about a metonymy and explain to you what a metonymy is. And then I will later on come back and explain to you what I mean by a metonylingual. So metonymy first. Many times the word crown can be used to refer to king or queen. A crown is an entity in the natural world. It's an object, but it's something that only kings or queens wear. And so it's associated with kings or queens. So in the sentence, the crown has approved a new law, the word crown, that refers to king or queen. Crown is a different thing. It's not a king, not a queen, but it's used to refer to king or queen. That's what we call a metonymy. Take this another one, for example. The White House refers to the president, or maybe the administration of the president. So the White House has issued an official statement. In that statement, White House here, you can say it refers to the president. Let me give you another example. That's a metonymy. The word pen can be used to refer to words used. The word sword can be used to refer to war, fighting, or conflict. So in the statement, the pen is mightier than the sword. There are 2 metonymy examples of metonymy. The pen is actually used to refer to words used. Maybe, words can be powerful. And then the word sword here is used to refer to maybe war, fighting, or conflict. Okay, that's what we mean by metonymy. So in summary, a metonymy is when an entity, something or an entity in the natural world is named and it's used to refer to another entity in the natural world. So a crown, for example, that's an entity in the natural world. Crown is used to refer to another entity in the natural world, which is king. Both of them, you find them in this world. Okay, what is a metonylingual? This is it. So a metonylingual is something or an entity in the natural world is used to refer to an entity not in the natural world, but in the lingual world. So take root, for example. We say, root is actually a metalanguage used by linguists. Use it to refer to the basic part of a word. But when you use the word root, you're actually referring to a part of a tree, an entity in the natural world. So, but then that is used to refer to a language feature or an aspect of a language, which is the basic part of a word. So now it is used to refer to something or an entity in the lingual world. That is what I call a metonylingual. Now note the difference. The basic part of a word is really not an entity in the natural world. It's an entity in the lingual world. So the word root is now used to refer to not another thing in the natural world, but to another aspect of a linguistic or language concept. This is very important. This is a very important principle because this is what I think a lot of how linguists have come up with metalanguages. And it can be very powerful because we basically invent and coin words to refer to something that is language related. This is a principle. Let me give you an example. I will go back now to Greek there was a Greek grammarian who lived some 100 years or so before Christ, and he was said to have been the first one to write a Greek grammar. His name is Dionysius Thrax. When he was trying to name the part of the language that today we call syllable, but I will not call that syllable. I will just call it's a sound involving a consonant and a vowel. When he was trying to name that, he came up with a name for it. And that word is syllabe. Now, syllabe is actually a compound word, and it comes from two Greek words. One is sun, which means together, and lambano means take, hold of, grasp. So basically hold together, okay? The other form of sulambano is syllabe. It's almost like a perfect form. And that's usually used to refer to a pregnant woman with a fetus. Or in other places, it's usually referred to two persons grappling, as in two wrestlers, you know. So there you go. The concept is two persons, a mother and the fetus, or the two wrestlers. There are two somehow holding on to each other. That idea is brought to the next level, to the language level, to refer to the language concept of a sound involving a consonant and a vowel. You just see the connection there, just like a mother and a fetus, but now not so much that in the lingual world, or at the next level, it refers now to a consonant and a vowel. What the Greek grammarian did is really, he just applied what I call the metonylingual principle. Let me give you another one. Again, there is from the same, the person I referred to. When he was trying to come up with a word for what we today call a conjunction or a joining word, there is another word that he found. It's called sundesmos. And again, this word, it's a compound word that means, you know, together, sun, and desmos, you bind something together. So sundesmos means that which binds together. And you can put two pieces of garments, of clothes, and you somehow bind them together. That's sundesmos. That's really an entity in the natural world. The grammarian used that and use that to speak of two words or expressions somehow tied together, or we would say joined together. And so now we call them joining words. So he uses an entity in the natural world to speak of an entity in the lingual world. This is what I call a metonylingual principle. Okay, I'm going now to something. Again, what this acrophonic principle is not the word that I came up with. It's there. I read it in the somebody who wrote what is the Hebrew grammar, Gesenius, and while he was talking about the Hebrew alphabet or the Semitic alphabet, and explaining how the Canaanites, the ancestors of the Phoenicians who were credited with coming up with the alphabet, the Semitic alphabet, this is what they did. So just think for a moment that we read books every day, so we read letters and all that every day. We don't realize that before there was a time when nothing was written and somebody had to come up with the alphabet. And it was said that the Canaanites, who were the ancestors of the Phoenicians, who came up with what we call now the Semitic alphabet. So this is the way they did it. There was no character to begin with, or no letter to begin with. They somehow need to come up with something. So somebody had a very brilliant idea of thinking of an ox, a picture of an ox, and then drew that picture, which is what you see there. I'm pointing to it right here, or this one right here. In the Hebrew alphabet, this is called the Aleph. But Aleph is actually the name of an entity in the natural world, and that's the ox, the animal. It's the name of an animal. And so that's the name of it. And then that first letter, the first letter is actually on the right, this one right here, I'm pointing at now. That's the Aleph. That becomes then the symbol of the first sound of that name. So the symbol or the picture now becomes the symbol of the sound. So the picture represents and also names the sound. So the name of the animal is actually the name of that sound, which is Aleph. So there you go. So that's the first Hebrew alphabet. This is it's the principle of what is this? Metonylingual is also used because something of the object in the or the entity in the natural world is also named, but it goes a step further. The name of the object becomes the name of the letter. And the first character that is used to represent that becomes now the representation of the sound A. So then the first letter in alphabet is given. The second one is done in the same way. In this case, the name of the Hebrew entity in the natural world is a house. And in the Hebrew, it's called a bayit. And so the first letter of that word now is used, the picture of that is used to represent and also name the sound B. And that now becomes the second letter in the alphabet. And the name of it is actually the name of the object, the house, which is the bayit. Okay. This is, I think, a very brilliant way of coming up, representing a sound with a picture. And this is actually the beginning of the Semitic alphabet, from which the Greek alphabet was derived, and later the Roman Latin alphabet, and then the English alphabet actually just came from the Roman alphabet. So this is a very brilliant idea. Out of this, applying this acrophonic principle, the Hebrew alphabet came about. This is the Phoenician alphabet would be a little different from this. I've chosen to use the Hebrew alphabet, which is a Semitic alphabet, just very similar to that. The names are very important. The first letter, Aleph, is an ox, Beit is a house, Gimel is camel, Dalet is a door, and you can see all those red. Those are the names of the objects in the natural world. And a picture that represents them is used as the letter of the sound that is represented by the first sound in that name. This is the beginning of the alphabet, the Semitic alphabet, which later came. Now, the Greek alphabet, I will not talk about that, but the Greek alphabet simply adapted the Semitic alphabet. So the Greek alphabet, the first one is Alpha. It sounds very similar to Aleph. The Alpha, Beta is the second one. Gamma, if you can just look at them, they sound very similar. The reason is that the Greek alphabet simply adapted this alphabet, and they say the words in the way they would pronounce them in Greek. Okay, this is what we call the acrophonic principle. I have also highlighted the other principles, and I'm going to give you some examples. So here, I'm wanting to talk about the functional, or what I call an adaptive principles. Talk about first the functional principle. In English grammar, we come up with a word like subject to describe the parts of sentence, so subject, verb, direct object, and all that. Usually we say that the subject refers to the part that the sentence talks about, or what the sentence is about. So we call that the subject. But in choosing the word subject, really, the focus is on the function of that word. So we call it just the functional principle. It's the function of the word that determines what word we use to describe it. This is what we call the functional principle. Let me go back now to the syllable word. I've explained this, how the Greek grammarian came up with the word syllabe to refer to a consonant and a vowel. But looking at it from the English point of view, there is a word in English that is called syllable. Now, and just by looking at, I am not a native English speaker, but when I see the word syllable, I don't know what it means. I know it only when after I've read linguistics or if I go to a dictionary. What the English linguist who came up with the word syllable is actually, this word syllable came from the Greek syllabe, the one I talked to you about earlier today. So in doing that, going from syllabe to syllable, this is what we call the adaptive principle. A word in another language is adapted into English, and that is used to refer to a language concept, which is, as we know, a basic sound that often consists of a consonant and a vowel. What is at play here is really an adaptive principle to talk about, to come up with the term syllable. Okay, let me give a few more examples. Take the word prefix, for example. The English word prefix is a compound word that has its origin in Latin. To an entity in the lingual world, which refers to something that is fixed in front of a word. In doing that, the principle that is at play here is really an adaptive principle, but also it looks at the position of the elements that we just talked about, that it's fixed in front of a word. You're talking position now. So basically two principles at work here. It's the adaptive principle as well as the positional principle. Let me give you another one. This is going from an entity in the lingual world to another entity in the lingual world. So when there is a word syntax in English, which refers to the study of order or arrangement of words and expressions and all. That's a whole branch of linguistics, study of linguistics. Now, the word syntax actually comes from the Greek syntaxis, which means order and arrangement. So the English word syntax simply adapts syntaxis, but also carrying on the meaning of the Greek word, which means order and arrangement. And that becomes the English word syntax. So two principles at play. One is adaptive principle plus the semantic principle. Something is adapted, and then the meaning of it is carried on. And that forms the meaning of the English syntax. This is a little different. You know, when I talked about syllable, the word syllable has its origin in Greek syllabe, I said. I don't think that any English speaker, when they read the word syllable, would have any guess at all that originally it referred to a pregnant woman plus a fetus or two wrestlers wrestling. It's just a word that is adapted into English, and then the meaning of it is, as is defined, it's a consonant sound that consists of a consonant and a vowel. Okay, let me give another principle that I've listed earlier on. So there is, for this example, it does not really matter which word comes first, whether it's allophone or allomorph, either one, it will still work. So there is a metalanguage that is allophone. Now, I would say that is really coined based on analogy on another word, which is allomorph. Allomorph means, allo means other or another, morph means form. So it's really another form of maybe a word or part of a word, or a variation of that part of a word. For example, when you form a plural, in English, you can add an S to a noun like coconut, and you add S to make it coconuts. But if you want to make a plural out of a word like, I'm just trying to think, bush, for example, it will be bushes. So you just don't add an S, you add an E and S. Now that's a variation of the plural form. That will be, an allomorph. Now an allophone involves a variation of sound. So allo is another, and phone that comes from the word sound. So I think that in forming one or the other, whether it's allophone or allomorph, I think it's based on the principle of analogy, that something has formed first, and then to form the other one, you just look at the other one, basically follow the way the other one is formed. This is what I call the analogical principle. And there is another one here. So phonology, again, that's another meta-language in linguistics, and it refers to the study of speech sounds. That actually is adapted from the Greek phonologia, phono, which means sound, and then logia, or from logos, which means word or speech. And again, the principles at play here are the adaptive principle. Phonologia is adapted to be used as phonology, but also the meaning of that Greek word is adopted and used as the definition of phonology. Okay, I have basically given you, although I think not all of them, but I've given you most of the principles that I have listed. What I'm going to do now is just give you one or two examples in the Lunga language, the grammar that the Kulu have been using, to try to show you that we have been using just the same thing. The only thing is that we have not called them by this, we have not thought, I have not thought about these principles. I'm just trying to now state these principles now that I'm looking at them. But these are examples. So there is also the Lunga Metonylingual principle. So there is an entity in the natural world, in the Lunga or Kulu culture, which is called Tamatina. Tamatina refers to a mother-child. Mother-child. Now so there are two persons involved. Now that is used now to speak of the lingual, an entity in the lingual world or language concept that refers to a sound involving a consonant and a vowel. Basically the syllable we talked about. I find this interesting because I did not know about the Greek syllabae. When we came up with it, we just tried to come up with something that would make sense to the people in Kulu, and it seems to connect with what the original Greek grammarian did in writing his Greek grammar. Again, this is an application of the Metonylingual principle. Let me give you another one. There is another entity in the natural world, an object, a beacon, a mark, or something that is placed on a reef somewhere that is submerged and the boat will not see it. So they need some kind of a warning or direction to tell them that there is a reef here, don't come this way. So it's called Agila in Lunga. That is used to refer to an entity in the lingual world that speaks of those markers or determinants, we call them, and they have functions, but they are called. They have certain functions that tell you this is something, or they point you to something. So again, this is an application of what I call the Metonylingual principle. There is more I could say, but I want to talk about how we view, or we decide to view, a word concept in Lunga that allows us to be able to use other words to explain or to describe it. So for this one, a Lunga word is seen as a piece of tree or a log. And so there is a piece of log, you can say, it could also be applied to a tree. There is a core part of it, that it has a core, there is a name to it. And then it's a matter of just anything you attach to the front side becomes the front attachment. And then you can attach something, middle, and then later on in the end attachment. So that is it. Now, based on that idea or that concept, we can now name those bits and pieces of this. So then that is now used to analyze a word. So a morphological or form or word analysis in Lunga would go something like this. The two suffix front ones are what we will call the prefixes. We'll just call them the front or the first, the front attachments. And the kolanga paranga, that's the core of the word. And the pasusu kokorapa, that's the middle attachment or the infix, something that is attached inside. And then you have the pasusu bebeto. Okay, that seeing a word like that helps us to name the different parts. And then you can then talk about it. I have to say that doing it this way, it sounds very funny at first, because people are not used to talking like this. They're not used to using an entity in the natural world to talk about an entity in the lingual world. But after a while, people get used to it. And basically, that's the way a lot of the linguistic meta-languages have been invented or produced. Okay, so what this means is this is kind of a summary thing that we end up draw the Lunga meta-language, or the meta-language we have used for the Kulu. We end up drawing from the culture, the experience, the events, process, and natural world, and the kinds of terms that we have come up with to describe the language have to do with the relationship terms, plant terms, descriptive terms, food, and all that. And use those to describe the language and be able to talk about it, analyze it. So now I'm just going to show you. I'm not going to talk about this because there are too many. But so these are the kind of words we have come up with. For sound concepts, the relationship terms that are used. Okay, and then word concepts, a lot of plant terms are used. And then the parts of speech, the relationship or descriptive terms are used. A phrase called, there are some food terms, body plant terms are used to describe the language. And then the parts of sentence, those. Basically, we just do that and to come up with all terminologies. A lot of them are functional descriptive terms, looking at their function, what they do, and give descriptive labels to them so that then we can talk about what they do, what they mean. And so those are just examples. They're just too many. And this is the pronouns. Again, we have to come up with terminologies to describe them and be able to talk about them. And probably the most difficult one of all is when it has to do with the verbs, how you talk about the verbs, because they don't really, the Lunga verbs do not really behave like the English verbs. So it's not possible to use that, even use the concepts adapted from English. We have to come up with something that looks like it's meaningful. So those are some things just for you to look at. So basically, this is just a summary now that we have come up with meta-languages or terminologies that are used to describe sounds of the different parts, aspects of the sound, syllable, word, phrase, all up to the sentence. And this is really not the end of it. For this presentation, I have kind of looked at, just ended it at looking at the sentence, but we have gone beyond that and come up with terminology to talk about, analyze a story, a complete writing. So that's basically the summary of what we have done. Now, I am concluding now. So the conclusion is simply this. So what I've said is really that a meta-language is a meaningful language that is used to describe or analyze another language. And I am also saying that there are principles that underlie the production or the invention of meta-language terms. In other words, when linguists come up with terms, many times I think quite unaware of what they are actually doing, they're actually applying the principles. So what I call the principles have not been stated as principles. I am stating them now. But I think these are the principles that underlie what linguists do when they come up with their meta-language. And then finally, what I'm saying is this, and this is important for other people who have their own languages. that are spoken. They have no written materials. I think it's possible to write a grammar of a spoken language using its own metalanguage. It definitely shifts the focus from a linguist or professional linguist to doing a grammar that the people who speak the language can actually use it. So it's really a shift in the way things are done, but I think it's possible. And the reason why I think it's possible is because I have done it. And what I've done has been used for more than 20 years now. The only thing I think is I'm not sure that I have done something good enough. So I am now doing research that kind of gives some linguistic basis to what I have done. So that's basically it. That's the end of my presentation. I thank you for listening, and I can entertain questions. Thank you.